Hello guys, I'm so happy to see you here at the Games Gathering Bratislava. It's a pleasure for me to announce our first speaker today in Elsho, Ranko Trifkovic. Ranko is a narrative designer at Viking Studio, and he is going to tell us how to create a memorable protagonist, as we know it's never easy. Before we start, I want to remind you, everybody, that you can ask speaker questions within the chat on the right. I give you the floor, Ranko, please.
Thank you. So, welcome to my talk. It's Talk to the Gun, or How to Craft a Protagonist Character. So, usually there is this big issue of how to create character at all. And in many game development studios, it starts with graphics, with design, with sketches. And then it goes on to refining or finding their character in sense of personality, likes, dislikes. And it's always the question of how deeply should we actually develop the character, considering that a lot of times character's role in the game is only visual one. Like we see the character and the level of interactions between characters are limited. It can be just the quest giver or someone to protect or something like that. But when it comes to protagonist or the player's character, the matters become much more complicated in sense of not only how do we want the main character, the protagonist character to look like, but also how developed we want them to be. Because in a lot of games, approach is that we present players with as anonymous and as vaguely general looking character, hoping that the players will fill in the shoes of this protagonist character. And as I'll try to convince you, it's not gonna always work that way. And also another big thing is like, how do we craft a protagonist character knowing that there is two widely different tasks for the character to fulfill? One is to be vessel for the player to enjoy the game. So we need to think about the player's agency. And the other thing is the role of the character in a story, because we want the protagonist to carry the story. Otherwise, protagonist becomes the spectator and sort of loses the role of a protagonist. So let's go. Who am I to tell you how to make these characters? Well, this is what my friends think I do. You know, working in a creative industry, making games, must be fun, young team. This is what game studios think I do. Right. This is what I think I do, you know, like being a great architect of the story, which influences the art, the animation, the gameplay, the audio, all focusing to create all the immersive experience for the player. But I hoped at least I will do this, you know, doing all the dialogues and choices and stuff like that. But actually, this is what I do. In the sense that I'm often invited when unfortunate accidents with the story and gameplay happen, and I'm a sort of narrative plumber where I try to connect back the story and the gameplay, because injecting a story in a strong gameplay can be challenging, because you want your narrative bits to correspond to your gameplay bits and vice versa, and it's not always easy, especially if you don't plan ahead. And that's why my dream of being a narrative architect and the reality of being a narrative plumber. So I was a game producer, a game designer, but also, and I fulfilled many roles in the game industry, but also coming from a writing experience, being a journalist, novelist, creative writing teacher, connecting the two, I'm a narrative designer. And that's why I'm going to tell you how to build protagonist character. So can you guess what machine these beautiful parts will form? Are you guessing? Well, it's the pile driver, obviously. Why did I show you this slide? Well, it's not always obvious from the parts what function they will have as a whole. And this is a reminder that characters are parts of the narrative and parts of the gameplay. And therefore, if someone shows you their character and says, oh, what do you think? Is this a cool character? it will be as if they are showing you one of these little bits. Because if you don't know what purpose they will serve, both within the game space and the narrative space, it's quite difficult to tell if it's a good character or not. I mean, this pile driver surely wouldn't work if there's some wrinkles and some problems with these parts, but it's only when the parts are as good as their role in the function of the whole that the whole thing will work. And that's why always consider creating your characters with the whole experience in mind, not just the gameplay mechanics, not just the story, but both combined. So here we see a producer, a game designer, and writing working on a story. Can you tell me which one is which? I mean, surely the producer is the happy kid, no, or the adult, maybe overseeing the whole process. Maybe this is a game designer, cheerfully designing the game mechanics and then hoping the writer will do something. Yeah, maybe this sad kid is actually a writer. Why am I telling you this? Why am I showing you this screen? Well, because it's often that gameplay and game mechanics come first, and then everyone counts on a magic of writing to inject the story or make something with the story. And it's not without reason, but also an extremely opposite can happen, that this is a narrative designer who's creating a wild story that no kind of gameplay or game mechanics can support. So whenever you're making your game, whenever you're starting either from the game design perspective or from narrative design perspective, it's always important that the both parts support each other. So if your story doesn't support your game, bad. If your game doesn't support your story, bad. And the characters are vehicles through which the story is told. We, as human beings, we are creatures of story. We live our life as a story and being, a first-person kind of game. And we see ourselves as a character and everyone else as NPCs. Or more or less, more significant or less significant characters. So creating characters is essential to both the gameplay and the story, because a lot of times, especially when we were kids, when someone asks you, like, oh, what's the game about? You start by saying, oh, there's this guy, or there's this airplane, or there's this motorbike, and then he does something, or they do something. So can you guess the game only by this picture? You probably can. You probably recognize that this is a Princess Peach and then Princess Zelda. But this is a challenge in the sense of, they're both blonde, they're both princesses, they both have ruby crowns, they both have pink gowns, but somehow you're still able to, tell one from another. And that's one of the miracles of the characters. You don't have to invent superbly unique characters, even for the player, even for the protagonist. It's just enough to have them memorable, and to have something specific about them. Can you guess who's who in here? So yeah, Doom Guy and Master Chief, Halo. And yeah, it's really a miracle that you could recognize them, because they both have sci-fi helmets, sci-fi armor, sci-fi weapons. And this is an example of a character who is created with anonymity in mind, so that the player can fill in their shoes. Is it a good decision? Well, since the gameplay is this first-person shooter, it shouldn't really matter who's behind the mask. It can be just one of the soldiers. So the action sort of takes place, and one could say that, yeah, it doesn't matter who you are as a protagonist character, but we know nothing or almost nothing about the Doom Guy, and the game's fun, but somehow he didn't evade having the storyline created for them. And Halo didn't even try to hide the storyline. That's why it has so many different episodes and games in the franchise, and that's why there is movies and books and whatever. So this is to show the importance of protagonist character carrying the story, even when they, when the initial idea and initial attempt was to create them as anonymous as possible, so that the player can immerse. But in this regard, immersion of the player comes from something else, and the lack of this background for the character shows in these later attempts to give some storyline to the Doom guy, and of course extending the initial storyline for the Halo character. Can you guess this character? Yep, it's the Pac-Man. And sometimes, as you can see, being unique looking and having the crazy sounds is enough to make your character memorable. Okay, so let's start with the anatomy of a character to see what makes a character a character. What is the element? What makes it the element of the story? First, we'll start with the role. Why is the character in a game? And this goes not only for all the other characters in the story, it also goes for the protagonists. Because basic distinction between characters is, are they drivers or are they passengers? The drivers are protagonist and antagonist, guardian and contagonist, in sense that all the story revolves around them. So who's the protagonist? The protagonist is the one who carries the story, who we are interested in. Protagonist is someone who pushes the story forward. If some other character goes away to some side mission, we don't care. It can be some episode, it can be some story arc, but it's not the thing. It's not the thing we want to hear about. And basically, there's a slight distinction between who is narrating the story, or through whose eyes we experience the story, and who is the hero of the story. In sense that, for example, in some games, the player's role is someone who's a support, who's helping the main guy or protecting the main guy. Same is in movies or literature. For example, Sherlock Holmes is a protagonist of the story. We want to know what happened to Sherlock Holmes, but Dr. Watson is actually the main character through which experience the story. He narrates us, but we don't really care what happens to him. We care more for the Sherlock, and he pushes the story forward. So if Dr. Watson invents something or does some crazy idea, we are waiting to see how will Sherlock react. The same with antagonist, in sense that the antagonist is always trying to prevent, stop, or compete against the protagonist. And in that sense, antagonist is someone who's almost the same as a protagonist. I mean, if they're going to be likable villains. Or in case of Japanese or Oriental narration, antagonists can be rivals. So they're not trying to actively stop or prevent the heroes from doing something, but they sort of, compete. And if antagonist makes a move, that's important. And that's what creates this drama. Also goes from the games where you have your player actively trying to, complete some objectives. And then the antagonists are not the minions or obstacles in between. The antagonist is the one, who's orchestrating the whole thing. Like, why are these obstacles in the protagonist's way? Guardian is someone who's helping the player, who's preparing them, giving them skills, generally who's supporting them. And in literature, it's usually like the wise old master, some sword master, or I don't know, Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, to Skywalker. And in games, it can be those NPCs who train you, who give you quests, and so forth. They're also drivers because usually something that happens to them deepens the story, creates the connection with the player character and so on. And they're very good to be used as initializing, energizing and immersing point of immersion for player character. Like the player will rather connect to one person guiding them, helping them, than the whole world as a whole. And Contagionist is someone who's actively working for the antagonist, but not necessarily being a villain or not necessarily collaborating fully with the antagonist, in sense that, I don't know, Darth Vader is an antagonist because basically he has his own agenda. He wants to rule the empire alone with his son or something, and doesn't, in the end, it's proven that doesn't fully support the main antagonist. Passengers are those characters who fulfill like the rest of roles, and it's really important if you're creating RPG game or a game where there's a so to say bench of characters which player can interact with or include in a party, and these are they can have many more roles than these described here, but mostly they fit into the roles of sidekick or skeptic, like someone who's fully supporting the protagonist, always by their side, Sam Gamgee kind of thing, or skeptic like Han Solo, like, oh, this is not going to work. And then there's the reason characters, who are sort of the intellectual gauge of the situation. For example, Princess Leia in the original trilogy, she's always telling them how their plans are stupid, giving us this rational perspective on the things. And then there is a motion character who's always overreacting or reacting from guts or from emotion, be it C-3PO, who's always afraid, or Wookiee, who's always like reacting with first with their emotions, who's always giving this outcry of emotion in a situation that calls for. Of course, these passenger roles can be combined in different ways, but for us, the important thing is to know that in games we have the luxury of deciding whether to place our player to be the protagonist, or if we put our player in a role of a main character who's narrating the story and sort of watching over the protagonist. There's also another layer of possibility in games. That's why games are creating sort of paving new way for narration, and that's that in no story whatsoever, in traditional storytelling, antagonist cannot be a protagonist. Yeah, you can have anti-hero who's a protagonist filled with flaws and not with virtues. You can have an evil guy or a bad guy or outright a villain in a role of protagonist, but then always there is a bigger evil, bigger antagonist competing against them, like in a movie Joker. But we cannot read a story or engage in a story where protagonist is a bad guy, a villain, or antagonist, because it goes against the nature of the narration, in the same sense that, I don't know, you cannot divide by zero. But in games, given the full range of player agency, yes, you can cast your players as antagonists, and that's something to consider, because again, the anatomy of the character will be the same. It's just the way they act and kind of freedom they enjoy. Let's move on. So the next important layer of a character is what, why, and how. It creates the meat and bones of a character. So goals, motivation, and ethos are these bones and meat. Basically, what answers to the question, what's the character's goal? What's the main character's goal? It's anchored to the plot, in the sense that if you present your player with the character who's in apron and chef's hat, and then there's stuff around them to cook, and then the actions that the player can take is cooking. Then that's the goal, to do something with cooking, or to cook faster, or to cook nice meals, whatever. But the very elements of the game and the story are going to dictate what. So that's why I call this hard-coded. And in traditional narrative, it's not so easy to express, like, what do you want to achieve. I mean, it's not easy to express for us in real life, like, what do you want? Well, blessed is the one who knows exactly what they want. But in games, these goals will be expressed and communicated to the player through objectives. And that's why the first moment of story building with your protagonist is to make sure that the objectives are connected to the plot, and that they are connected to the role of a protagonist character. So if you make a game where the player starts with a machine gun, yeah, that's the goal. Shoot something, shoot someone. If you give them option, do they want to pick a machine gun, or you want them to pick trumpet or drums? So this story or this game branches widely, because I don't know, if you pick a drum, maybe you can make enemies dance, and maybe if you pick a gun, you can make them dead. So these goals will be widely different. But then, as you see, you have two widely different games put in one place, or two widely different stories put in one place, and that's what it means, this anchor to the plot. I mean, imagine a game, I don't know, say Witcher, and then you're given, shovel and a spade, and then Vizimir shows you the plot of land, and then you dig and you make your own garden. Okay, the genre from that moment on changes into something unexpected, to say at least. Next moment is motivation. Why are the players, doing whatever they're doing? And this is a point of immersion for the protagonist character. Why? Because this motivation is easiest to mess with, because it's not really visible. You cannot create tasks or objectives or goals and then express motivation through them, because even in real life, motivation is not easy to discern. It's because it's internal thing. Like, why am I giving this speech? To be more famous, to say thank you to my friends, or I don't know, to support the organization. You don't know. You cannot know. I can tell you oh, I'm doing this because I love gaming, but you don't have to believe me. It's difficult to assess. The same is with characters, and that's why it's easy to mess with, in the sense that you can have professed motivation, hidden motivation, revealed motivation. And the motivation gives a lot of flavor. It's not the same if someone is helping from the bottom of their heart because they're kind and good, and it's totally different if someone's helping someone because they have some profit from it. It's hidden under the surface in a narrative, in a traditional narrative, and it's usually in these moments of break where you have a calmer situation, no much action going on, and then usually this motivation is revealed through some intimate moment, oh, why are you doing all this? Oh, I trying to do something for the world. And then these moments of calm are where the motivation can be sort of hinted at or discussed. The trick with motivation is if it changes wildly, even for the protagonist, it brings together a moment of melodrama. For example, you have Darth Vader, and his motivation is to stop the rebels and to capture his son, and then he changes the motivation in the dramatic peak of the story at the very end, and usually it's not only melodramatic, but usually comes with some sort of redemption, oh, that knight drops his sword and picks up a spade and becomes a gardener. I don't know, tends to little bunnies and pets them and blah blah. So the motivation can be changed. but it's because it's really intimate and hidden under the surface. It's easy to play with, but also a bit different to express. And being different to express, it means that it's also difficult for the protagonist to be connected with the motivation towards the player. What does it mean? So the player will enter your game. They will want to see what controls, if they understand or not. And they, from that point on, when they are, okay with the controls, the player will start sort of resistance towards your game, looking for something fun to do without being cornered into being emotionally invested. Especially if you shower them with like, oh, sorry, help our village, we're dying, you have to help us. The player will usually go like, oh, I don't care for your village, but I'll do it because that's something to do in the game. So motivation is a lot more difficult to impart, to immerse to your player than the goals, for example, because goals and objectives are, they came to play it. These are the goals and objectives. Okay, I will start following them. That's why you can solve this problem in two ways. One is to have solid, firmly created character, which you introduce to your player, basically saying, this is you, this is going to be your character. And he comes or she comes with the motivation, expressed, of course, through, show, don't tell. And then the player has the choice whether to identify or not, whether to, get in these shoes or not. But if you give them a blank spot, like, okay, you are some warrior in some armor and you have no face and you have no voice, the motivation is not there. It's going to be difficult to impart. You will rely only on gameplay to provide the motivation. Oh, I'm going to play this because it's fun. But for any storyline, it's going to be very thin, very, very questionable, and you can have holes in a story narration later. There was one cool trick which I learned from Jeff Vogel and Spidersoft Games. They have really amazing series of old school RPG games. And the game I'm hinting at is called Abaddon the Black Fortress, where at the very beginning of the game, when player just makes their character, picks their class, powers, or whatever, they're encountering a peasant who says, oh, like, why? Oh, I see that you become a powerful agent, and why are you doing this? And there's going to be this list of this like 12, 16 questions. Because I want to be famous, because I want to be rich, because mom and dad told me to do so, because I want to do. And whatever player answers, this choice has no repercussions in the sense that there is no feedback. There is no like, oh, because you have chosen this, something else happens. But the role of this question was to sort of immediately connect player with the motivation. So you know your goal, you've picked your character, you've picked your skills, you've picked your flavor, so to speak. Okay, what's your motivation? Pick one. The very fact of picking one motivation connects players strongly to this idea. Like, oh, this sounds cool, to be an agent of powerful force, to right the wrongs and become just. Of course, nothing holds back player from doing all kinds of things you allow them to. That's the question of player agency, but it powerfully connects player to the motivation. And of course, ethos is about how do you do things. It provides the alignment. I mean, we know if someone's good or bad because they behave in a moral or immoral way. This how is important because it turns the regular character into fully fleshed out character. So this 2D into 3D doesn't mean graphics. And it can gradually change to develop a character, but it carries a comedic flavor when it changes. That's this famous like, no more Mr. Nice Guy, when the ethos changes, like, I'm not going to be nice anymore. I'm going to give them hell now. So ethos is very important because for a very well-crafted villains and antagonists, it's important for them to be as similar to the hero as possible, to have similar goals, similar motivations, and then ethos is different. Like, oh, this guy chose to, go about his way by doing good stuff, or I don't know, moral stuff, or even limiting some sort of responsible behavior, and the other one will be bad, selfish, irresponsible, or whatever. Ethos for the protagonist player character depends on the agency you give them. If you give them the chance to rob everyone blind, okay, you're providing them with the chance to belong to this ethos. If you don't, then you're sort of limiting your players to this, and this is going to be key for the point of this presentation, because it doesn't always have to be this extreme: good, bad, or gray. Evil, neutral, or lawful, or chaotic. It doesn't have to be always this way. This span of ethos can be made smarter. And of course, then there is the rest of the details, like names, omen, est nomen. So if you name your private investigator, Dick, it brings certain private Dick and kind of mimetic meanings. Of course, the background is important. Who are they? Do they have parents or not? And please, no heroes who are orphans. That's a cliche. Just because he's a hero doesn't mean that they need not to have parents. And of course, visual appearance is important. How do they look? What do they resemble like? And character's voice, not in the sense of course, audio bit, but like how are they speaking? The waka waka waka. Remember, so the character's voice is mannerisms, the words they use, how elaborately they speak. And this is quite important for characterization of your character, because it's usually how they speak that you can recognize. Remember from Warcraft, like "Yes, my lord," these peasantly voices. Okay, so that's how we know that they're not so powerful, while, I don't know, someone's speaking in more educated manner, so it indicates that they could be a wizard or something like that. And of course, all the other unique bits that you can think of. These things, though, they can be left to your player to customize by themselves, is good if you have a less story, or if your story is emergent, like in Sims or Ringworld or Dwarf Fortress. But if you want to have a story, strong story, of course connected to the gameplay, then these details is also something you can give to your player. Like, okay, your name is this, your background is this, you look like this. Maybe it can be changed during the game, but for starters, you look like this. This is how your character speaks. This is some unique quirks. Because it seems counterintuitive, like, oh, you're boxing in your player. No. You're giving them freedom through their span of their activities, of the verbs that the game uses. Giving them solid frame for a character, that's something where the player's imagination can kick in and work with. Basically, no player or no consumer or no audience is going to be creative or interested to be creative to immediately start, filling all the details about the character. They need something to hold on to. That's why even these little bits and details can and should be provided by you, especially if you're going to build a strong story. So, players as a protagonist, as you've seen so far, it's all about player agency versus the narrative structure. Basically, if you have an open world where player's agency is unlimited, question is if that story can have a strict narrative structure, for the simple purpose of being difficult to keep track where the story checkpoints, where is the story, what are the story moments. But also, if you have a stronger narrative structure, then there are some things that players shouldn't do. I mean, if you tell your player through some cinematic or some story that he's a knight, blah blah, then it's a bit lame if they rob grannies or slaughter innocents or whatever. Of course you can. I mean, you can give them this agency, but then if the story continues with everything nice, like, oh, our brave knight, he finally reached the outskirts of the village, and then he burned it 5 minutes ago, there's going to be clash between the gameplay and the narrative structure, and that's what we're trying to avoid here. Okay, so this is a little video. I want you to
It took a while,
see.
but I got used to living again. Was handling it pretty well, in fact. Yeah, right. And she struts in. Death herself. In high heels and a short red dress. She'd come to stir up the forgotten past. To give me a job. It sounded like a cakewalk. But there was always a catch. I'd played this game before. I was a hotshot back then. Full of myself. I lost everything. Lost her. This time, I've got an ace up my sleeve. Nothing to lose.
Are you for real? Did you just skip mentioning your bestest friend in the official trailer? God damn it, Cooper. I always have to save your sorry ass.
So, yeah, this was a clip. I hope you could hear the audio. This is the clip of the game Let Bions Be Bygones by Bohemian Pulp, and it's up on Steam as early access, I think. And this is going to be our example for today, how to create and how did we go about to create a protagonist character with slightly different, approach than the traditional, good, evil, bad. So we started with like the boring stuff, okay, he's a nice guy, he can be a bully or he can be neutral. But the fact is, a lot of times in this game, there were going to be cinematics which bring the story forward, and they're going to revolve around this gritty, down on his luck, cliche, almost, archetype character of private investigator. And since it's a noir game, a cyberpunkish noir game, and it has a strong storyline, then this approach of being nice guy, bully, or neutral didn't really cut it, because you need to keep this player's characters somehow be able to continue plausibly to tell the story. And since it's a noir game, story is quite important, the atmosphere is quite important, but in the same time, the authors are creating point-and-click adventure with a really nice world, which they want players to be able to navigate in different ways. So there is no like choke points, there is no like typical puzzles to be solved. And so this approach of being a nice guy, bully, or neutral wasn't connected to the gameplay and wasn't connected to the story. Again, in some second iteration, aggressive, sneaky, or neutral was a bit more attempt to sophisticate and to further develop this initial idea. But again, it was too wide and too dysfunctional to be used through the game implementing a story. And that's why we decided to go with something else. Okay, I will skip this because we don't have time.
It was just a tip.
So from this nice guy, neutral, bully, we decided to try something else. Scientific or curious, empathic or emotional, cynical, introspective, and then the gun. That's why the talk of this title of this talk is Talk to the Gun, because talking to the gun is one of the paths that we want our player to take. So what's the difference? As you can see, the difference is that each dialogue, while having the similar input and the similar output, goes through different little layers of how the player interacts with the NPC while still being the same character. So it is still a noir detective down on his luck, cynical, guy, but with a scientific approach, it's more like being about objects, about curiosity, and it connects to the gameplay because player will interact more with objects. They will get more clues and more puzzles solved through examining the objects. Empathic ones are sort of a bit more kind, but it's not necessarily good. It can be someone who's simply understanding the others, or maybe he's crafted to sense the feelings of the other character, and they will get more clues from interaction with NPCs. Then there's a cynical one who's more introspective, more about black humor, but also they gain more clues and solve more puzzles by talking to themselves. Something similar to what Disco Elysium did with this talk to yourself and unlock the superpowers. So not like that, but still like, I interact more with myself. And of course, we decided to go for this extreme of being ruthless and then opening the position, opening the chance to talk to the gun and go really crazy. So basically, whatever player decides to go with, it's still within the frame of archetype of a detective who is in noir story. So none of us is all the time good, all the time evil, all the time aggressive, or someone's never aggressive, but maybe they have something else which are they constantly. But even these kind of guys, when they're left alone, maybe they're aggressive, against the wall or against something. They need to vent this out. What I want to say is that no one is good, evil, or neutral all the time. And if in the player's agency we allow player to swing wildly from good to evil, then it makes difficult at the story checkpoints to tell the consistent story. But with this, we not only connect players' behavior and agency with their character, but we also allow for a more subtle, more nuanced way of interactions. As you could see, there's no wildly different ways the dialogue talk. It's about the player's choice how to act and about the flavor of this specific kind of mood, so to speak. So no one said that a curious character should be cold and unintuitive. So you can decide to approach this particular moment in game with curiosity, and the other part of the game with calm or intuition. So this is the improvement. This is how we can actually create a protagonist character, which really ties in to the gameplay, to the story, but also give a bit of fun. Like, okay, if you unlock the ruthless route, let's talk to the gun. Let's be, wildly crazy and excessive for this particular run. Why not? So to conclude, to craft the protagonist, you need to consider the needs of the story, consider the needs of the game, decide which one comes first. Is it your game or your story? Start from there. If you're going to connect the game and the story, it's okay. You can start with your game first. The proper workflow here is not rigid and strict. But consider the role of your characters, even the protagonist. What is their role in the story? What is their role in the game? And then try to find ways to connect the story interactions, the player's agency, with the needs of the narrative. How to create nuances, how to create a character who can still have choices, but stay within this framework of what's plausible for them. And then you will be rewarded with carefully crafted agency. You will know exactly in which moment, in which scene, in which part of the game, or generally in your game, what verbs to use, what is accessible to the player. Because by what is accessible to the player and what is restricted to the player, you will create much more flavor and much more character. In the old days, before these mobile games and these wonderful computers we have, there was an era of like very, very small computers with very, very tiny graphics and very, very tiny memories, and the dawn of gaming, the prehistory of gaming. A lot of games would simply not allow this wide player agency. So some things you simply cannot do. Some interactions are not possible, and that's how players would understand. Oh, this is important. This is not important. If you can interact with it in this way, it's important. So, for example, if you're playing a strategy game, and you have a general, and then you don't have an option to attack, what will you think? This general is a coward. So, carefully crafted agency supports the flavor of your protagonist, tells the player more about the protagonist than all the graphics and all the this good, evil, bad, open agency. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed, and I think we still have some time for the Q&A. Of course, if you don't manage to get your questions answered now, please feel free to contact me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ranko, for the presentation. It was very interesting to know what aspects really influence our character experience. And I think, yes, it's time to move to the questions. So the first question will be, what's the most interesting character you have created?
Most interesting character I've created? Well,
Or you like the most?
Most interesting, or what I like the most? Well, there is this character of a blind captain that I really enjoyed, because it was for an RPG game, and it was to be someone who the player interacts with, and it was a girl, a blind girl on a pirate ship, and the captain of the ship, and it was like a lot of triggers, like, oh, first from like, oh, there is a girl, pirate captain, but she's not dressed in some sexy costume or being this kind of character. She's just regular lady, but then she's blind, she cannot see, and then she fights, but she's not a Mary Sue. She's not like able to conquer, I don't know, the world or defeat 1,000 goblins. She just learned how to overcome her limits, and I think that's my favorite character, because she was unusual, unassuming, but also like subtly powerful, and it gave the player a hint how overcoming obstacles is possible, but also it put a question to the players about the limits. Like, is it, even if it's a fantasy game, are the possibilities unlimited or not? Which was a theme of the game, and that's why I like this character, because it was connected not only to the gameplay and to the story, but also to the overall theme of the game.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. It sounds pretty interesting. And the next question would be, what's your favorite protagonist?
What's
What's your favorite protagonist?
My favorite protagonist?
Yeah, you have presented some of the examples, like good designed protagonists, but who is your favorite and why?
Favorite protagonist? Well, I must say that I enjoy more sandboxy games, like RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress or Sims, because you can create your own protagonist there. And I really enjoy this Rim world, especially, and of course the inspiration for this, because you can create these really zany characters, these really crazy characters. And so what I like is that no matter how their skills or statistics are powerful or not, it's still predominantly about their personalities. It's still, and even more so, how they interact with others. So for one of the playthroughs, I've created this cheerful cannibal who's living in the far north and welcoming guests and eating them if he's not happy. So I think that was my favorite protagonist. Like always a bit mismatched.
Yeah, okay. Next question would be, does Sam not more a guardian for Frodo and Merry and Pippin is passengers?
What?
I like characters from the Lord of the Rings, I
Uh-huh.
believe Sam and Frodo. And is Sam a guardian for Frodo?
No, Sam is a sidekick for Frodo because he's never giving up. He's never leaving the side. He's unquestionably believing. The guardian would be, of course, Gandalf because he's guiding them. He's providing for them. He's taking them to adventure. Guardian is usually someone who trains the character, initiates them to adventure or something like that. Sam is a sidekick because we don't care what happens to Sam. We care what happens to Frodo. But Sam is always there to unquestionably support. And the genius of Tolkien is that he creates a moment where Sam becomes a hero. And that's the beautiful moment when he starts defending his master, pretending to be a mighty warrior, killing all those orcs, blah, blah. So yeah, these are the little moments. And they can work in the game as well, in the sense that often you can have some unassuming passenger kind of character who suddenly becomes gets the spotlight, and we hear their story and we see their struggle. So this kind of breaking the mold moments are quite important both for the story and the game.
Thanks for the answer. I think it's where we will end our session. If anybody have other questions, they can ask you directly.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks a lot for your time, and I hope to see you soon again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.